Hi, welcome to the Sales Compensation Show, the podcast where revenue leaders and sales comp experts share strategies for driving sales performance. At Former AI, we recently hosted the Sales Planning Summit, a virtual conference covering the biggest trends across sales planning. These conversations were so valuable that we're interrupting our regular programming to bring you the live discussions with incredible leaders from renowned organizations. In this special episode, 3 distinguished VPs joined us to discuss the interplay of art and science as applied to data-driven territories, quotas, and incentives. Listen in as Former AI CEO Nabil Alazam sits down with Edie Cagle, the VP of Global Revenue Operations at SAS, Maria Oshko-Kanant, the VP of Sales Compensation and Planning at HP, and Nandini Ramaswamy, the VP of Worldwide Incentive Compensation at Microsoft. We hope you enjoy.
Super excited to be here with Maria, Nandini, and Edie. Thank you all for joining. And I think this is a very interesting topic. Before we dive in, I want to share kind of a tip of an example. We've all heard the Moneyball example, the Moneyball story of using data, but this is happening in every part of our life. I think Stitch Fix as a company is a perfect example of an industry, a concept of style that is truly seen as 100% art, has now merged data science with art, and neither has lost out. It's not that data science have completely taken over, or that organization relies entirely on humans for the art of it. It is a combination that is resulting in a better outcome. And I think, to me, we're at a very interesting inflection point with sales performance management and sales planning. And so I'd love to get a sense from each of you on where you believe sales planning is today. Is it science? Is it art? Is it a combination? Maybe I'll start with you, Nandini.
That's a great start. For me, I think it's a continuum, right? It's a continuum of, you're right. I think both art and science play a big role in sales planning. And it's a continuum in that we are all aspiring to get more and more into science, but there is still an element of, art in it. So in my case, in Microsoft, we are using data science extensively, machine learning, both that as well as, AI, generative AI, in various aspects of what we do. And so our hope is that we move further, but art still plays a big portion of what we do. And as we talk more during the day, I think during the session, we'll talk a little bit more of, how we're doing the change and aspects like that. But I think both has a role, both in terms of the delivery, but also in terms of, really inspiring the sellers in terms of, how they are going about it.
Edie?
Yeah. So I'll follow up on that, Nandini. I completely agree. I think every company is progressing at their own pace when it comes to data versus science. Ideally, I think we all want to be completely data-driven. But the reality is there's so much art that comes in from field expertise and field experience that we need to incorporate into our sales planning that sometimes our data can't represent effectively. So I think there has to be some sort of mix between art and science as we progress further towards the heavier side of science.
And I'll speak a little bit to maybe the art aspect of it. So I think we all want it to all be science and everybody to be aligned. And if the data shows it, we must go. At the end of the day, we're dealing with sellers and psychology. So for me, it's really important that we can have the best planning cycle. We can have the best data-backed science, so quota planning and design. If we can't communicate it in a way that's motivating to the sales reps, if we can't offer transparency, then it's just lost, right? They need the art because they are driven by motivation and the North Star and the aspirations. And I think that's where you can over-engineer on the data side, where it's based in data and you're also trying to explain yourself out of that data box with data, which doesn't work for sellers. So I think communication is just as important. Transparency around the planning setting process. And again, we can showcase all the ways we got to the answer. It has to be a way that can create a North Star for sellers and be really motivating.
Yep, 100%. I mean, I think there's the human element's not going away anytime soon on sales. So you have to somehow get them to understand. And so if you think about at the heart of, I think E touched on this, as well, in the sense of the heart of science has to be accurate and robust data. And if you don't have the data to explain something that's happening in the sales motion, or you don't have every piece of it captured, it's also very hard to build the model. So again, you need that R piece. So I guess maybe just to step back and look at your data journey and how you're using data within your organizations. Would love to just dive into that in terms of how you're applying and using data across territory and quota design to start? And maybe I'll ask you, Maria, to kick us off here.
Sure. So in my past lives, you know, it's been more of the, hey, we get a top-down number and we use, maybe current state, white space, some TAM analysis and then sort of give it to the field. That tends to be the motion. We play around with territories and sizing and call it good, right? And somewhere the truth lies, and we'll over-engineer. We'll see different areas get 250% on accident, right? And some not perform because there was a miss. And that happens. But generally, you want to be in that sweet spot, right, of 80 to 120% accuracy of where everybody will fall. However, over time, what we realized is you can do unique things, whether small or larger, and add in different data points. And I caution this because I think people sometimes will go crazy and try to align 20, 30 attributes to planning, when really at the end of the day, you can probably focus on 5 or 6 that really help define the planning motions, whether it's design analysis, quota, or territory. And we focus on those, right? So in a prior life, right, we narrowed down the focus to win rates were giving us good signals because each of our products were truly specialized and different. They didn't actually play always well together. So we really needed to look at win rates. Pipeline and pipeline integrity. So we had a really good pipeline integrity process. We felt very confident in that. So we were able to use that metric. We actually incorporated things like the tenure and the support of a rep. So you can have a tenured rep, but are there support networks? Are there SEs? Are the other people around them also tenured? So this notion of tenure and expertise as a team to attack that pipeline actually played a role into whether we gave somebody aggressive quotas or not. And then being able to segregate down. I think everybody talks about this equity quota distribution process, territory distribution process, and that's okay. But there's always going to be outliers. And so you don't want somebody to not have to get out of bed in the morning. And so being creative on ways like, hey, do we segregate out a pocket that should be A+ players? Or do they need a C+ quota, right? Because the opportunity may not be there. There's some market dynamics that we're not sure of. To be able to start parsing those out. So it's not to over-engineer and make it very person and persona specific, because you do lose some of the flexibility and the bandwidth to be able to do things to get to that sweet spot of accuracy. But can you do enough, right, to truly differentiate to where it matters to the organization and the business, and to give goals that are aligned with whatever the strategic niches are? So you can go from that generalized motion to, adding in a handful of metrics that can help get you a better answer sooner. And then, of course, doing the next line of steps to kind of make sense of your planning methodology.
Mindy, I'm curious how your data journey is like. I mean, like, just before that, I pass it over to you. Actually, then it really did double click on like the network effect of people working together. Maria, is actually a point that I think I haven't seen that commonly being used across the organizations that we're working with, and I think it's a very powerful one because it is a team sport for most sales processes. But yeah, Nandi, we'd love to hear how you're approaching it.
I mean, given that you call that specifically or on the team pace, yes. So from our side, there are two. Let's talk about territory and quotas, right? So I would start with principles. I mean, so that is less science, but it's totally, design principles, right? What is the principles we're really going after? Maria, you mentioned, of course, equitable. And so for us, our equity starts at the territory level. And then, of course, quota just mathematically follows as kind of the idea with some art in it. But it really starts with the equity in the territory. And when we say equity, it's the opportunity that you have in the territory. Obviously, territory sizes, segment sizes, they would all vary. And then the support model, which you both alluded to, but really, what is the team? I mean, we have 40,000 sellers across enterprise and small and medium business, and and we also have consumer business and public sector and federal and gaming. I mean, you go around. We have a number of very different businesses, and of course distinct focus areas there. And so to really scale around that, we start with first principles. Once we have the guiding principles in terms of what is the account segmentation, what is the blueprint and the ratios we want, what is the coverage ratios we want, and for that we use elements of data which is really focused on how did last year's performance work, right? And you brought up tenure, you brought up the attributes that you have in a seller. So we use all that data to say what is the right territories. That's just fundamental from an org design and therefore the priorities. Then we get into quota-setting, and this is where we use extensive data science, which is that we use machine learning. You were talking about you had a very narrow focus, Maria, in terms of your prior lives. We went the other direction. We use 1 billion. And I promise you, when I joined the company 2 years ago, I checked, is it really 1 billion? It is actually 1 billion. We use 1 billion data points, given our breadth and depth of our scope. We use 1 billion data points to run our models to get at what is actually the quotas we want at the territory level. So the territory level quotas is therefore not person specific. It is chair-based concept that you see in the industry. So it's really on the territory, what is the quota? Based on when I say 1 billion, the numbers, the data points we use are budget and financials, prior performance, future aspirations, emerging product to new product, what is the TAM? So it's very the territory data, so it's very similar. But we have different compensation metrics and so on and so forth as well. And so, there's the overall piece of data that we map. Once we have the data, then actually comes some of the art, which is where we allow for humans, which is the actual field representation, to touch it and modify it within guardrails. This year, we are actually going even further and saying that we will not just do ML, we'll do ML by default, which means data produced by our machines is going to be the quota because we're doing all the upfront work in terms of making sure the data scrubs are all in place, the territories are designed fine, and we're really explaining quite a bit. It's going to be a big, interesting change for us. And so commenting about change management, it's a big focus area in terms of how do you land the story, how do you transparently explain what did the ML model actually tell you, and it's an empowerment exercise too, because now we're saying, yes, trust it, because we've proven over years that this actually works. We've actually been in the ML journey for about 5 years now. So and then add to that Copilot, it's actually gotten pretty sophisticated, but there is still the element of changing hearts and minds, and that's coming up literally next month. So wish me all luck, but that's where we are. The only other comment I'd add, besides the actual planning perspective, and the process and the governance and the data, the technology, there is also the year-long learnings you've had in the prior year. And that's a super important element that our Copilot in this case can actually absorb. So looking at performance over the year and lessons we've learned over last year, that and proactively monitoring our data, those are all areas where we use our AI, but that feeds into how we want to foolproof our quota-setting process.
I think too, like an important point you just mentioned is you can take all those millions of attributes now, right? We have the capabilities now to make it create something that's meaningful and not overwhelming and not confusing. And that's where we hope to go as well. And I think that's really important is once you get it to something that's consumable, that makes the difference, which, you all already down that path. So that's super exciting. And then one thing you touched on is releasing it to the field. We have set guardrails, right? 8,500, right? Sellers need some guardrails. We try to keep it to just 6 or 8 here currently, and make everybody follow them. But even then it tends to get controversial or political. And, it's all the firmness of the support you have around you to keep those guardrails, because you as a sales comp leader, myself, we can all say X, Y, Z. But at the end of the day, the business has to support that as well. HR can't override you, right? Your CFO can't override you. We all have to have unification. And that's where I think a lot of us sometimes run into challenges. And so I'm a big proponent of saying, here's what happens if you don't do this, or here's what happens if you're not listening to the fields. And as long as we're clear on that, please, right, in 6 months and 12 months, don't come back and say, oh, this failed, I wonder why. Well, because we let go of our guardrails, because we didn't listen, we ignored the data, we ignored the art. So of course we weren't going to have the outcome we expected. Those are tough conversations, right? But I believe in sharing those risks up front. And then that way people at the end really can't hide behind a we didn't know excuse.
Okay.
I think this is all fascinating. And Nandini, I think you guys are way ahead of many, I think, with all of your millions of points of data. Back to the question that Nabil asked about data journey. SAS is a nearly 50-year-old company. We're going to celebrate our 50th anniversary next year. With that comes a lot of legacy infrastructure and a lot of modern ambition. So we've had, siloed systems and data for numbers of years, and we're on the trajectory to try to integrate some of those systems and make our data hygiene better and more complete. So we obviously need to beef that up before we could ever get to the point where you guys are at Microsoft. But I'm curious about your data journey. How did you get, Microsoft is just about nearly as old as SaaS. How did you get to the point where you have all these millions points of data and be able to trust in them and you know, um, be able to rely on the models that you're building?
And I would offer up that it's a super valid comment. I mean, while I'm commenting about I'm going to ML by default, I also said hopefully it all goes well. So, but we also have a history to the point you're making. I think even having access, honestly, to the models. When I talk to colleagues in the industry, it's even having access to models and the data is one big piece of it. And you're right that our experience is very similar to us in that we have legacy. And I would offer up, bottom the cloud and therefore growing in the cloud and, setting up systems and processes and aspirations are, I think, different sets of, issues to changing a company that comes into play, and therefore all the breadth and the depth and the complexity you can have. And I'll be transparent. I joined about 2.5 years ago, and my agenda was less around running the business, which of course we have to do. We have to pay the people and design the plans and, respond. But also it really was around simplification and modernization. That's my agenda. And so when we talk of some of the journeys we're doing, these are pretty big, bold bets with tons of risk and lots of focus in terms of making sure we have the foundational blocks. And it's a slightly longer term journey, but we need some quick wins. And that also addresses some of the comments that's in the chat about change management, things like that. We've had ML in the company for 5 years in this space. And yet, even though we've had all the ML, we've allowed for every field operations BSO to actually modify it. So when you start looking at quota churn and things like that, it does change quite a bit during the year. And that is not the optimal experience we want any seller to have at scale. And so when we're making this change we are doing right now, we're being very thoughtful both on the data elements. The quality of data is very hard to get. The interface between systems, we know data architecture is super important. So the timing of it and the quality of it and all that. And so the interface of the systems is super important. And that's why I alluded to things like proactive monitoring of our comp metrics and, things like that. They're not perfect, but they've definitely moved quite a bit in both reduction and simplification, but also modernization in terms of quality and trying to fix it in year. So that by the time you come here, I want one time quota set, not change during the year unless it's, truly over thresholds and which is not today's experience. And so I do think it's a multi-year journey, but we had to do a lot of work improving again and again with data to say the trust element that you brought up, which is when some of our analytics, for example, said we've had 5 years. Let's just look at the last 2 years. If you look at the things that have been changed to the things that were not changed, in fact, with our ML model, the attainment is actually very similar. That was a very important point to land. In fact, I would offer up, we did the other thing too, where we had hundreds and more than hundreds of people touching the quota within guardrails. They didn't do significantly change. There was adoption rates. We looked at adoption rates. It was 97%, 95%, things like that. And so it's the appetite for risk, but the time you can actually give back to the sales leaders and the sales roles is tremendous. And so we spent a year, the last year, in actually, really proving out what we believe is why this will work. But year one of transition, we do have some safety valves, candidly, because I don't want to change quotas in year, but if you need a release valve, what do you do? So we're being very intentional around that, but it is multiple facets around quality of data, the data architecture, the technology systems, and then access to AI. In our case, besides spending a boatload of time on change management and winning the hearts and minds, and we'll see how that goes.
I think what's really interesting too is I think everybody probably on the call, unless you're a brand new startup, deals with legacy mindsets, processes, technologies. One thing that is great about this notion of AI or machine learning to me is that we will be able to combine things like sales field survey results, the sales comp team's opinions and personas, right, and expertise, along with AI insights. And what I'm finding is when I triangulate those, the opinions tend to align. And now the naysayers, what can they say, right? There's these embedded legacy mindsets that we deal with. I know I deal with them, right? And a lot of us deal with them because on the call we're part of big complex orgs. I think those those mindsets start to have to be changed. As much as they don't want to, as much as there's resistance to change, the more data we can add to it and add in that notion of psychology and art, the more, what's the excuse? Like, you're the only naysayer, right? The data side says no or yes, right? The survey results are speaking for themselves. Sales comp, who lives and breathes it every day and is in charge of this, is aligned to all those opinions. And now, hey, you, Mr. and Mrs., whoever, you're adamantly against this, but what are you pitching that opinion on anymore, right? We're dispelling those facts.
100%. In fact, I'd add one more comment. This is actually, this transparency that we're trying to bring to the table is actually also helping us with compliance and removing bias. Because we are now saying, while the BSOs in the regions could, again, they have the best field information, I acknowledge that, because again, we have 40,000 sellers globally in so many countries. But at the same time, by putting that more in the data scrub process, before we actually determine the quotas, right? So if you are a feeder at that point in time, then the fact that the independent machine, we've trained it and you trust it to the extent, then there is no human bias. Then you're not saying, you're my friend, I'm going to give you the best territory or the better quota, because it's all more scientific. And that has helped. Again, going back to the C-suite that you need alignment with, it's helped because you have different personas. You have the chief compliance officer, different from the chief CFO, different from the chief revenue officer, so on and so forth, chief HRO. And so yes, I'm very in line with what you're saying, Maria. And plus, this also helps.
I mean, I think the point around introducing data and getting people to buy into these tools, like one of the things that I think, first and foremost, a good rep, your best performers, are never going to say no to a tool that's going to get them more revenue faster. And so I think the adoption of tooling now with AI is only going to be seen as a positive for the sales organization. And so you're going to see kind of potentially that pull. But the second piece is you have to back up every decision with data. One of the things that I've seen kind of being on the side of seeing what's happening to their customers and et cetera, is you have leadership changes and shifts. And what you need to do is you also need to kind of back up how you got to here needs to be captured in a story that kind of builds up, so you can onboard new leaders that are coming in that are potentially coming into something much more innovative than what they had. And the final piece I'll say is, we collect a lot of data. I've seen people collect a lot of data on the quota-setting methodology, but you almost want to collect just as much. And you touched on this, Nandini, around how much is being manipulated or modified by the sales organization, and getting the understanding of why they modify it, the context behind, was it a market event? Is it something that they knew about the account that existed somewhere else? Helps you better measure how effective sales input is, again, the art. And then it helps you kind of put constraints and better boundaries around it, because at the end of the day, there is bias. There's a lot of bias that exists in quota setting, and that's ultimately how you hold and measure people's performance in the role. So it's quite important to solve. But yeah, it is a journey, and I think you touched on it correctly. And it's like you have to build up the confidence over time to do it right. I guess when you think about the point that Maria you made earlier on, that you have to tell a human being on the other side of this what the outcome is. You have to tell that story in an art form. I mean, how do you actually? And I think there's a question that came up in the chat around how do you take something that is so scientific and get buy-in from the end rep, where now this is a black box. I'm blaming this complex algorithm for setting up me to fail or succeed, and so would be interested to get your perspective on this, Maria, and then pass it around.
Yeah, what's interesting is so haven't been at HP quite long enough to run one of these sessions, but in my past life, we actually had this feedback come back. We've just gone through New Year rollover. There were a lot of questions. How do we come up with this quota? Where did it come from? I know you guys looked at pipeline. I know you looked at the historical. I know there was this output, but still don't feel great about it, right? My friend said they don't have as big of a quota. My peer in the other company doesn't. So what we actually did that even surprised me, had so much buy-in, was we actually ran a quota planning session for sales. And we walked them through our methodology. We did it right after, we did it during sales kickoff, or maybe like right before, maybe, I can't remember. And we just did a 30-minute presentation on what we look at to get to quotas, how we get to the end result. And what we did is we pulled up comparison sites like RepView that share things like seller profiles, average quota size, average deal size, right? What do peers in the industry actually deal with when it comes to quotas? We pulled in examples of recent teams that have expanded or gotten smaller, and we showed the impact. And I didn't realize how beneficial that was. Everybody wanted copies of it. Everybody wanted it recorded. Everybody wanted sub meetings with their own teams to go over that. And it was just this aha moment of what just a little bit of reminding does and a look under the covers, what that really does for sales. And when we sent out sales plan letters 2 weeks later, we basically didn't get a single pushback on the quota side. And it was so beneficial to where in the past we would have gotten a good 10-15% kind of coming back, questioning things. Now, I do attribute some of that to a more disciplined quota setting process where we didn't involve everybody and their, their relative to be able to comment on the quotas that were being distributed and some more housekeeping and just integrity around the process. But this definitely made a huge impact. So if you're not having these knowledge share sessions and letting people look under the covers from a sales perspective, it was very simple visuals. It was 2 slides, sorry, maybe 3 slides, core principles we go by, where we didn't meet those principles this year and why, how we align each profile persona to what we know is out there in the industry, and then what are things that you can do to impact or not impact. Those slides were super beneficial, and it just, again, changed the trajectory of people's understandings, and it really helped the managers more, because I think managers get hung up on explaining the whys, and they punt it back to the planning team, or they punt it back to their sales leaders, and the ICs, or the individual sellers, should be able to go to their managers, and their managers have a talk track of how to explain it. So they took that session and were able to then have them self-education as well as educate for their teams. So just a different way to think about it, but very, very beneficial in my past life.
That resonates so much to me. Something I'm actually going to steal from you, Maria. I'm telling it publicly. So that's a great idea because we've been spending all our efforts right now focused on our executives to get the sponsorship for the buy-in, and that they will stand in front. You alluded to that. I think you and Edie earlier on, that you need the execs to also own it, right? Not just us being in our little silo. So we've spent a lot of time on that. We've spent a lot of time on our managers to explain, and so we're giving them the content and the why and the what and building them along with it, and of course the support, the sales ops teams that support them. What we've not actually thought about, because we don't usually, is around the sellers itself, which is we are actually equipping the managers to go tell the sellers in terms of how it's happening. So we've explained everything in terms of our change, but that's again our scale motion, because again we have about 40,000 sellers, and so we have not done that. But I also know, just hearing you, that I've heard you have to say something 7 times for something to land, and change is a emotional process, not just a scientific process or data process. And so I think even we have planned for office hours like extensively, but I think your idea of specifically talking to a seller in an office hour in terms of this session to how we got it obviously scaled up for them is a super valid idea, which I am going to totally do.
I think we've done something similar as well. And in the past, we have really just focused on the sales manager piece, but giving them collateral to be able to have the conversation they need to have with the AE to understand their compensation plans, their quotas, and what their expectations are for the year. We haven't been consistent doing that year after year after year. So that's the other thing that I would caution is, if you start that habit, make sure it's consistent. Because we do find in the years where we haven't done that, we get a lot more pushback. So I think that the education and the transparency is key. Consistency is also very important.
And I'm happy if anybody, I know I saw some comments, if anybody wants to see the 3 slides, I have them whitewashed. So if you need any templates or examples, reach out to me on LinkedIn. But yeah, I think you just mentioned something, like focusing on the management layer. I'll be honest. Every time we kind of go down, we assume the management layer we're at is okay, and they'll just trickle the information down. And my lesson learned over the last 4 years, especially as we championed enablement of the seller versus managers, was that does not happen. Even had some experiences that already here at HP where we sort of have to pause and say, wait, yeah, we did tell that layer of management, but I guess they didn't tell anybody else. So, well, 6 layers just got missed. And so I think, being able to just say, look, it might be over somebody's head. They may not be interested, but at the end of the day, I do think it helps for all layers to hear the same messaging. With our tools today, we are transparent around everything. If you use a forecasting tool, if you use a pipeline tool, if you use an incentive comp tool, you see where you are, you see all of your data, your manager sees all of that. We should be no different with comp plans and planning, right? We should be able to speak to the different levels and not keep this in a black box, and you'll reduce a lot of frustration that happens in the process, right? People let go of that anger bridge and say, okay, whether I agree with it or not, there's some logic. All right, they've done the checkpoints, okay, and I either like it or I don't. So I think it helps add to the credibility when you can just kind of target everybody with messaging and say, hey, we're all working with the same things you are. And I'm sorry if to date, right, you haven't been exposed to that, but you do, you can see it and you have the logic behind you.
The aha for me is actually the push on also Coda. And I say that because the enablement to the seller, because even some of the comments in the chat, the enablement to the sellers on the actual incentive plan tied to the strategy, we go all out. I mean, let's like all out in like hundreds of moments, from scaled motion to in live motion to all kinds of things. We do it. What I think my takeaway is because of this probably historical practice of manager enablement on quotas to say how we derive, because it's revenue aspirations at a territory level is kept confidential. I mean we can talk about the company's aspirations, but we don't say you can add up and so, things like that. And because of the confidentiality, we haven't been sharing the quota derivation. We've been sharing broad principles and how we derive it, but not the specifics. And so I think the push here for me is actually do the same on the quota side as well, without, of course, still balancing with the confidentiality that is required appropriately, but that isn't in the actual numbers, but that's not relevant in terms of the principles that go behind it and the approach that you're doing. So that's...
And I would say, like, Nadine just hit on something important. So there is this concept of being too open. We had our lesson learned a couple years back with the team I was working with, where, you let everybody see under the covers. And the truth is, if you want to keep things not as political, if you want to keep things not as subjective, you do need to consume keep some notions within the decision makers, right, who are driving and holding the baton. And maybe a couple examples of that. I don't know if every layer or the IC themselves needs to know things like how much over allocation there is in a number, right? I don't know what good that does. I don't know. We never shared assumptions on acceleration or overachievement, right? Those were kept within a small set of individuals who are part of the process. We don't need to expose everything around a territory dynamic. So there's certain things, right, you just have to balance. But again, you really honestly half the time don't have to get that in the weeds. If you just give the concepts and you give the steps to get there and you can compare fairness. And what's really important, and I don't know why people shy away from this, compare yourselves to the market. If you have a problem and you go on site, and sorry, I use RepView because I just think it's awesome to have a place to go for sales comp and planning stats. It's like the Glassdoor of sales compensation. I go on there, I check the org I'm at and their scores for sales comp. If you don't like what you're seeing, then change the story, right? I mean, let's not shy away from how our companies are perceived in the market. If you are lucky enough and you work for a top 50 company in the United States, that's amazing. That's great. You're doing a lot of good things and there's always room for improvement. But if you're not, start changing the story. Don't shy away from the fact that there's bad data. We called out a metric where we know we're not great. We can't say we're going to get better this year, but we know something's off and it is top of mind and we will be working on how to improve that. And sellers sometimes just need to understand that that something doesn't feel right or look right, or that it's not competitive with the market, and they're willing to stick it out with you. They just need to know it's on top of your mind that something's misaligned.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I think you can go too far to the extreme of transparency where it's not needed. And I think the one thing that we talk about gaming occasionally and kind of the manipulation, right, of the data, et cetera. But there is some balancing or some benefit that we have to overcome gaming if there's a slight misinformation asymmetry between kind of the planning versus in the field. And it kind of alleviates some of the negative elements that come with sharing, way too much of that transparency. I think there's a few great examples that you shared, Maria. I think the one thing to double click on where transparency does help, if we're sharing that we're using X, Y, and Z data attributes to drive at quota setting, then recognizing that the moment that we tell the data story, if we don't also share with the sales force what what our perception of accuracy at a data source level and how we're mitigating against the inaccuracy, then the first thing that calls out that entire process is when a sales rep sees some inaccurate information. When in reality, you're designing this process to handle the fact that data is not going to be 100% perfect every single time. So
I think also too, it's also pointing to how do they influence it. So Nandini, Edie, I'd be curious to hear like your perspective. So for example, margin is really big in our industry. However, you look at sales survey results and half the people are like, I have no clue how you get to margin. So thanks. I guess I'll just keep selling the way I am. And at some point the margin metric calculates and I get balanced off that. I always like to share, we have a change coming up in margin or definition. How do you impact that? Right? I think it's important for a seller to know where they can impact it. I think everybody on this call, all 100 plus employees have seen metrics used where the sales rep maybe doesn't have full control of a metric. That's okay. Sometimes we have to do that for business reasons, but can we point to them where their impact is? And I think that takes it all the way through, right? You'd have all the best planning in the world. And now you've said, how can you actually impact that metric that we're using? And I think that's really important. And I don't think, we're always great at that. We move a little too fast. I think that's a good place. I'm just curious if the others have done that before, right? Like actual impact analysis when coming up with a new change or new methodology and saying, this is where in your sales motion, maybe it's an enablement question, how you actually impact this new definition or metric.
That totally resonates. I mean, I think I mentioned the comp metrics in the past, both from a proactive monitoring perspective, and now you're talking about how can you influence it. And so we are spending quite a bit of time in ensuring, to the extent possible, that comp metrics for individual plan is something they can influence. That is all of our North Star, I'm sure. And so that's what, we're all trying to focus on. And so we do that for sure. And then there are some that they may not influence. So one of the things we're doing is we've actually now created one pagers, where the one pagers is not only, and it's not an uncommon practice, but in all the enablement, we have a one pager by role, but which really says here are to maximize, because I really want you to maximize your compensation and be inspired so that you can actually land the company goals, but you also maximize your own rewards and comp. And so with that, we say, here are the 4 or 5 things you need to do. Of all the comp plans we've done and of all the enablement content, we have websites and SharePoints and PowerPoints and people landing it and AI questions, chat, all of that, all of it part of a chat, part of an enablement journey. We're also saying here's the one pager which says here are the things you need to do, the 4 or 5 things which will make you maximize your comp. We explain the why. That's big. That was a lesson learned. The explaining why we have something in their comp plan, because it's not always. Well, I assume that the company strategy, therefore you see the comp, but putting the why behind it was super important, specifically to your comp. Why do we have this particular metric or this bucket or whatever we have, and then what can you do around it? And while we don't, which is what you're alluding to, which is how can you, and we have the definitions put in there as well and things like that. The other piece is, while we don't go and talk about accelerators to the point you made earlier, we do talk about in the kickoffs, or the plan is to start talking more about what are the big winners you've had in the past as well, because that's the rah-rah moment, right? To really inspire, to say you can make $1 million or whatever the case might be. And so those are aspects that get into it. So it's the why and what has changed. And the definition, and then the quality of the metric in the year. That is actually a bigger focus for us, because the quality of the metric, and that's where we use proactive monitoring with AI, is because it's great to do all the planning and land it. So there's planning, we're talking about it, we land it. And then there's the actual in-year, what's happening in year, and data quality is always has opportunities, and so proactively monitoring where you're not waiting for the payout, and then after the payout, all the support tickets, suddenly mushrooming, and you're getting hit, and all the leaders are escalating. It's how do you ahead of time get into some signals where the data is dropping or whatever, and also how do you have not just a human do it, but actually AI can point to us proactively saying, hey, there's a blip here, and eventually get to causes. Right now it doesn't do causes for us, but it does totally connect us to say here's a blip, and so go look at it. But you've set the expectation from a governance perspective too, right? The agreements we have with our data providers and things like that, so that you can actually address that. I would offer that that's an important point as we look at data quality during the year.
100%. I mean, yeah, it's a great like segue into, with more data in the sales planning process and a more data-driven approach, like how does that impact the cadence that you run and operate your planning cycles? And I obviously, yeah, from your point, it's like you don't want to wait till the end of the year. You don't want to wait till it's too late to react. I guess I'm curious across, all of you, have any of you increased the frequency of which you're running your planning cycles because of converting to a data-driven process?
To clarify, when I said we have proactive monitoring, I still believe, right or wrong, I still believe that planning should be annual. So because again, at the scale we are operating, we want annual planning cycles. The business clearly wants us to be always on planning. That's a term that we are absolutely expected to support. And so the difference is the entire rhythm that we're doing in a planning process, which is pretty significant because we want to align to the next year's strategies and enable that in our comp. We want that. I still want that to be annual. However, I do want space to react and respond to in-year agility because of the pace we are acting, especially in the AI context. Because in our company, as many of you, we're in the race for AI too, in addition to responding to all the macro and microeconomic conditions and all of that. And so we have to be agile. I cannot say, oh, we have a new change that's happened in AI and we'll wait for a whole year. No. So I have specific mechanisms to respond, which is usually in the form of honestly spiffs and contests, which are prioritized, and it's not many. It's like things like that. The basic good discipline with spiffs, but that's the reactionary mode, responsive mode for in-year agility. And then when we have issues with the data, yes, if it is actually purely prohibitive, we address the data issue, not the change in the comp, or the quota. We addressing the data issue proactively, which is different from planning in an annual cycle for what it's worth.
I think interesting question, right? So I actually come from a prior life of about, I think, 8 years on semi-annual. Currently semi-annual. My past life we changed to annual. I know nobody likes to talk execution or admin, but semi-annual is a hell of a workload. It takes up so much time to rinse and repeat. And the excuse gets used, we can't move fast enough because we have to make a decision in the next 120, 180 days because we're already in the next cycle. So nobody wants to rip massive Band-Aids because there's not enough time. Or we don't give ourselves enough time to try new things. And if it's not successful within 6 months, we just call it good or change it. We just don't give it the right amount of time. So I'm very much pro-annual. I think sales cycle buying times have changed too with recent economic effects. I think there's a time and a place for more frequent plans. But for the majority of folks, annual seems to work with the opportunity to be flexible. I always believe in, obviously you need a system and a process in place to be able to be agile with quotas. I think spiffs and bonuses fix those reactionary momentum, right, areas that you may need. And there are certain profiles, inside sales and others that definitely drive better off a quarterly performance period or semi-annual. But if you talk about the constraints, if you want time to do analytics, if you don't want this hamster wheel of an approach, 3 months, 6 months, if you're with a company that always is saying, well, it didn't work, forget it, or it's too much change, that's where it really bites you, right? And that's why the annual motion becomes more attractive. It's easier to consume. For a seller, right? It's line of sight and it's finite. One thing I constantly got when it was less than annual at any orgs I've been at is they were a common complaint in the sales surveys. So sellers just felt like it was an opportunity for the business to do bait and switch on quotas twice a year, 3 times a year, whenever they feel like it, without rhyme or reason. So unless you have an event happen, like a market share gets taken away, something gets added, there's a boom, you think the time allocated is well spent. I don't think you get the ROI now on all of those planning activities that have to happen multiple times a year.
Yeah, I agree. I think I'm completely aligned with you guys. An annual planning cycle, specifically for comp and quota, is exactly what we need, with the flexibility to be able to run spiffs or incentive overlays throughout the year to drive short-term agendas or test new behavioral levers. But you're right, to do the analytics and to be able to make a sound decision for how we're going to transition the company in a future year, we absolutely need the time to do annual planning. The key is, back to Nandini's point, to monitor that throughout the year. Like, find where the bubbles pop up or where the errors are occurring and be able to adjust accordingly. But I think annual is the right answer.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I think I truly believe in a world where it is far more dynamic than just the annual base plan, and it's tied more to selling cycles and specific opportunities. But you have to have all your data systems interconnected flawlessly, and it being run, truly like a machine with human oversight. Which is, by the way, that's everything that we're going towards is that. But until you have the infrastructure, you're right, that admin kind of overhead or even the buy-ins to the data and experimentation. I mean, that overhead of political management and change management on a 6-month cycle in enterprises at this scale, it's quite difficult, unless absolutely required because of the selling motion. But the one thing that I want to double click on is, Maria, your point on the experiment not having enough time to be tested. I mean, that could still happen with annual plans. And I think one of the things in any sort of big change, the hypothesis of how you're going to measure that outcome is so critical in the change management and conveying it to executive leadership and getting buy-in on that. Because I have seen things that have kind of been axed too soon when it looked at leading indicator levels like it was headed in the right direction. And so, it's sad. It's always sad to see that, because it's there's clearly it was something there. But as we come to, sorry, yeah.
Sorry, Nabil, I was just going to round out on that. I think, sorry if anything breaks up audio-wise, but I think one of the other things on there is again, it just goes back to that level of transparency on data, right? Getting real-time data and feedback helps. I've seen a result of somebody trying to act something, and in fact, I was like, no, this is a really good program. We need to keep it going. And it took a little bit of, survey some people's opinions. So I encourage everybody to figure out real-time data, real-time consensus. Don't be scared of surveys. Don't be scared of feedback. I think that there's a fear out there of these tools, and I don't know why. Because it either tells you what you already know, or you're just afraid, right, to perhaps throw away what you know, right, for a different perception that's out there. But I think that all helps in this case. So if you can do that, we're able to dispel the fact, hey, it's not working. In fact, it is working. We just need a little bit more time, right? Enablement hasn't caught up. Marketing hasn't caught up. The go-to-market strategy hasn't caught up. But this is a good idea. Or it's the opposite. And, we're able to say, hey, let's cut this off early with real insights and data coming at you. You should be able to do that. Why waste 4 months, 6 months on a program that just isn't serving the purpose?
And I would offer up, we speak about data quite a bit, right? Real-time data, totally on point there. But with data, I would also offer up governance and alignment. And I say that because aligning on these success factors at the onset, what is deemed successful, what is realistic? I mean, it's a pilot, so we of course don't know how it's going to play out. But aligning on what is success metrics, what is the go, no go, when do we yank it, and when do we not, and when do we, if it's not, what is the degrees of it, so that we can, maybe we don't yank it, but we let it play out further. But aligning on that at the onset is so much easier, and we can still flex it, but at the onset, than when you have the results. Because then there's lots of emotions involved, and people, there's the parties who wants to yank it, some who want to continue it, and then you don't have this neutral element of it. And so process, governance, principles, all of that, with data and technology can really propel us further.
Agree.
Just to wrap us up here, this has been an amazing discussion so far. How do you think in the near term, and I'm going to tee this up with also answering a question that came in the chat, which is asking you, Nandini, to share some of the, how you're using AI and in both, planning and design, and long term, with the fact that more details to come, but we're going to be hosting a session where we talk specifically about the use of AI, and Nandini's with Nandini here in the coming weeks. But how do you foresee the data-driven sales planning, shifting across the market, not just within your businesses, but across the market over the next, over the next coming years? Maybe like the biggest change that you perceive to happen.
So I think I'll chime in here. I think one of the biggest advantages that we have with AI is that we're going to be able to be less reactive and more proactive. I think as AI matures and we have the data that's to support AI, we'll be able to build more personalized quotas and plans rather than kind of a one size fits all. And we'll be able to use a lot more information to be able to identify these personalized plans a lot better. And AI, I believe, will always continue or will continue to augment some of the human interactions for the plans. I still think it's super important that humans have a strong say in how we design our plans and how we, roll out our quotas. But I do think it's going to be a very helpful tool, at least as a challenger model. It allows us to question ourselves. Where could we do better? What have we done wrong? And I think AI is really going to help us move in that direction a lot quicker.
Heavily aligned. I'll say two other things. Exactly what you said, Edie. To me, it's going to definitely improve lives, but augmented, as you said, right? And so to me, there are two things I think that I think is going to change. One is the actual quality of life of all of us in the comp profession, because I think the busy work will be done hopefully by these AI models. And so the augmentation or we're becoming agent bosses or AI bosses rather than, I think that's all of us, not just us, right? Every single individual in your team, they're really going up the value chain in terms of the quality of work they have is the fond hope. And I see that already. I don't take notes anymore, or things like that, right? Because AI does it for you. So I think that's going to be another very big important change, which means, again, given all the expertise that I always find in this space, it's sometimes amazing how much we spend time on just the busy work, and that will all hopefully go away. And AI does that, and then you can do the truly value add, high end work. That I think is probably the biggest I would offer up with AI that I'm looking forward to.
I'd say the same thing, right? We always balance this, at the end of the day, a portion of our teams and our work is tactical, right? We have to keep the lights on. We have to run a process. So I echo, Nandini, what you said. I'm just looking forward to those skill sets being elevated, being part of the conversations as to why, and the transparency, better customer service. I think we all ask for that, right? There's orgs that do it well. There's some that do it, okay. And there's some that don't do it well. And that customer service back to sales, back to the operations field, we all could use some time back with that.
Yeah, I couldn't agree. Yeah, couldn't agree more. It's there's so much skill set and capability required to execute on sales comp and sales planning, and 90% of the effort is put into just keeping the lights on and doing day to day versus actually thinking about the massive cost center that is the investment that's made in sales. And without a doubt, this has been an amazing discussion. Thank you all for being a part of it and sharing your experience.
Thank you for having us.
The Sales Competition Show is brought to you by Forma AI, the sales performance management platform that fully integrates sales planning with rapid, scalable incentive compensation management. Our data platform brings together how you can plan and manage the entire lifecycle of territories, quotas, and incentives. With global customers like Autodesk, Stryker, and Hootsuite, we enable go-to-market teams to plan and deploy even the most complex SPM strategies at speed, taking you from idea to execution instantly. To learn more about Forma AI, visit our website at forma.ai. Hit the subscribe button and find more episodes of the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube. Thanks for tuning in.